Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Well, folks, welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism. Been a week since we last spoke. I hope you and yours are well, and everything's going fine for you. I'm joined today by a newbie to the show. I'm delighted to have Roger Anderson with me. He's a former history teacher and a man who obviously studied history at both Edinburgh and Bristol universities. He also lived in Bristol for some time. He's been also in grassroots political and movements, including anti-fascist and trade union activities. Welcome, Roger. You're here before I'd finished the big introduction for you there. I'm sorry. I'm still going, but I'm just, if I get anything wrong, let me know. But after you finished teaching, you moved back to Scotland just in time for a referendum in 2014. And since then you've got into the tourism business, which I'd like to touch on later while we're chatting, because it's very interesting, because you're using your history of knowledge, or your knowledge of history, your experience of teaching and your love of Scotland, and turned it into a wee business, which would that be a fair way of describing it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a bit of a passion.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to get a wee plug for that now. If any of you are going on holiday and going to do one of these staycations and you want to do a tour of Scotland and historical surroundings, Roger's your man there. He will be your guide and give you the historical background into that. And this week, I have to thank you. You wrote a guest blog for me, Theories on History, which has generated an awful lot of interest, young man. And I'd like to discuss that and other things, because would it be fair to say that your area of expertise is the Jacobites and the 45 rebellion? Would that be a fair assessment?
These days, that's an area of special interest, for sure. I mean, I would say the 18th century in general, because of course we have the Hanoverian Anschluss of 1707, which takes place right at the beginning or near the beginning. So that's very interesting. And actually, you can't understand the Jacobites and what happened with the Jacobites without understanding what happened in 1707 or just before 1707. That's a sort of pivotal event, or these are the pivotal events of the 18th century, and the ripples continue.
We still feel
right down. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, one of the things I say to people when I take them, one of the first things I say to people when I come to Culloden battlefield is that this, pointing to the ground of Culloden, this is ground zero of modern Scottish history. And in some senses, it's ground zero of modern world history. It's a pivotal event that have changed world history, because effectively, if the outcome had been different, I mean, there's an argument over whether the outcome could have been different, but if the outcome had been different, we wouldn't have seen the British Empire. And there's a whole lot of historical events that lead on from that, including, as I point out to Americans, including the American Revolution, which are.
Let me be a devil's advocate in that. That is assuming that it was purely the ideas of the kings to have an empire, and not the people that surrounded them, the merchants and the City of London people, that whether they had a Stuart king or the Hanoverians or King William of Orange, they would have still behaved in the manner that they did and done it through the king and in the king's name. Is that not also a possibility?
Well, the key thing to understand about the Jacobites post 1707 is they wanted to end the Union.
But did they not sign a document in Edinburgh when they took Edinburgh Castle?
When they took Holyrood, from Holyrood, they made a decree, or Charles Edward made a decree. I think it was signed by Lord George Murray, his commander in chief. 9th of October, 1745, stating that the pretended union, because that's what they called it. And you've got to remember, there are a number of people who say, oh, yeah, but he said this, and he would have gone back on his word. But for the Stuarts, the union was illegitimate because it had been signed by an illegitimate monarch, a usurper. So in 18th century terms, the whole basis of the union was illegitimate. So Charles signs this document. It's published in the Caledonian Mercury, which is one of the main Edinburgh papers at the time. And it states that the pretended union of these kingdoms is at an end. But doesn't just say that. It goes on to say that any Scot who attends sits at the Westminster Parliament, be he Lord or whatever, will be proceeded against as a traitor to his king and country. The country they're referring to is Scotland, quite obviously. So what the Jacobites were essentially trying to do was reverse the union and create some sort of federal relationship. Now, in 18th century terms, a federal relationship doesn't mean, it's not the modern sense of federal. It's a treaty-bound relationship between the different nations, if you like, of these islands. So they were. That's Charles quite obviously wanted to grab the crown in London for his father, but they were the majority or a great many Jacobites, as we call them, who are attracted to the cause, both in 1715 and 1745, were attracted to the cause because certainly the ones who and some were press ganged into it, certainly the ones who weren't press ganged, both armies were doing the same thing there. They were attracted because of this promise to end the union.
Yep.
So we see artifacts like the swords and the dirks, which have prosperity to Scotland or Scotia and no union. That's quite crucial. And if you actually look at some of the captured weaponry that went on display after Culloden, you'll find little grooves on them, and they've ground out the engravings which have said that. And of course, the whole Hanoverian propaganda machine goes into overdrive afterwards to layer on this propaganda about exactly what the Jacobites were about. So they tell us that they were a bunch of Catholics.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, but that was not true. That's not true. Even today, there are people who are the die-hard unionists. Shall I say, some that support a certain football team? Not all of us, but some of them particularly like to push that. Oh, you Jacobites, they were all Catholics. That is just untrue. Most of them are actually were not Catholic. Am I right?
Most of them were Protestant. The backbone of the Jacobite movement was Episcopalian. But there were quite a number of Presbyterians there as well. And in actual fact, I was quite surprised recently. There's a thing called the Jacobite database online, and I was looking at some of the information on that, and there's some pie charts, and there's a pie chart of prisoners at Carlisle who were taken or taken down there in the aftermath of the Rising. And in order to try them in England, which actually was a breach of the Treaty of Union, incidentally, because they were supposed to be tried under Scots law, and Scots law had different rules when it came to being a traitor or whatever, which is what they were trying to pin on them. But when you look at the pie chart, you actually discover that the majority, or largest chunk of prisoners at Carlisle, because they've gotten down by religion, are Presbyterians. And I was actually quite surprised by that. But the majority of prisoners that were being held in Carlisle were Jacobite prisoners, were Presbyterian.
So all you out there who think otherwise, you have now been taught by our teacher here, Roger Anderson. If I could go back just prior to that, about the Union, another myth I would like to explore, or actually explode, is that Darien had actually bankrupted Scotland and England bailed us out. Is the truth not that the boroughs of Scotland themselves were booming, and it was the gentry, the same ones that signed the who sold us out were the ones who had lost their money in Darien, not Scotland, not the ordinary boroughs, not the ordinary people. Is that true or false, my belief?
That's essentially true, yeah.
Essentially, or is true?
Well, the problem with debt at that time, or money that countries owe, is that you can't push modern economics or the modern banking system onto most countries at the time. The only countries that had central banks that were working in a slightly more modern basis, as in printing money and creating money, were France and England. Both
invented by Scotsmen.
Yeah. John Law being a very important figure in that, Scotsman. The irony before the union took place was John Law actually went to the Scottish Parliament and offered his services, telling them that they could move on to a modern banking system as invented by Scots themselves. And they wouldn't have any problems because prior to the union, prior to the 1707 union, there was a union of crowns, and the crown, which was based in London, had control over certain parts of Scottish policy, including war and the military. You might call it the MOD of the time. So Scotland was having to finance essentially wars that were decided on by the Crown in London, and this was causing problems for their financing. Scotland, like most of the rest of Europe, were working on a sort of just-in-time system, so they would pay their debts at the end of every year. They would pay the money owed at the end of every year. They weren't using a central bank, and that was the old medieval system of finance. So they were having to pay an awful lot of money towards, if you like, wars which were causing problems for Scotland's trade, because Scotland's major trading partners were some of the people that England was choosing to have wars with, like France, and Scotland was ending up financing it. One of the things that leads up to the union is the attempt by the Scottish Parliament to look at ways of getting out of this, including when the Queen, it's Queen Anne, she had no children. She was quite clearly going to leave the stage. She wasn't that well. They had to choose on a successor, and the argument blew up over Scotland saying that it reserved the right to choose its own successor. England said no. It's got to be Hanoverians.
The Declaration of Arbroath, indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got this tumult. The idea that Scotland was bankrupt as a result of probably about half of Scotland's national finance was wiped out. But the people who were particularly, so it wasn't a good situation with Darien, but the people who were particularly affected were a number of nobles. And interestingly enough, these are nobles who, when you look at the people who were bribed and so on and so forth, at the point when they're pushing through the Treaty of Union, these are the nobles who, or some of these at least, are the ones who were offered bribes. But it wasn't just bribes; it was land in England as well, and estates. Bought and sold, essentially, yeah. And one of the reasons for their being so keen on this idea was that they had lost a lot of money through Darien.
But if I could move on to this, because what you were saying is part of this blog, and if you haven't read it, folks, go to my website, www.barheadboy.com, where you get a plug in here, and look for theories of history, and read this completely. But they go on to say is that there's this myths about different people, be it Bonnie Prince Charlie, the handsome brave man, not so much, and Winston Churchill and others, because it's going to lead us on to something else. But there's good guys and bad guys, but things are not black and white, not in history, not in real life, and not now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really the crux of what I'm saying there. That things are a lot grayer than often. I think we're cultured into thinking that things are very black and white. Look at Hollywood movies. Look at there's a whole history of it, media history of it. you know, there's good guys and bad guys. So the bad guys do bad things, the good guys do good things, and one or the other. But when the good guys win, they quite often go through a bit of adversity, and we have our own stories that sort of fit this mold as well. But it's often a lot more complex than that. It's often a lot more nuanced than that. You know, the stories around Bruce and Wallace are a lot more nuanced in some ways than we might like to think they are.
But there is one exception to that, I would say, is, you know, that the good guys that are in Through a Scottish Prism and the bad guys are on BBC Scotland. That's fact. But as part of that,
of course.
Yeah, but as you part of that, you were saying is what we shouldn't, as a movement in modern day Scotland now, be looking upon some person, as you put it, in a white cowboy hat, riding to the rescue, and we all sit back waiting on this messiah, this great leader, this Bonnie Prince Charlie, this Winston Churchill, this Nelson Mandela, this Mahatma Gandhi, this Alex Salmond turning up. Oh, that's right, he's here. We shouldn't be looking for someone to do it, but we, the people, have to take matters into our own hands.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm trying to get across. That, you know, people, good guys, good people, and you know, when I say guys, I kind of include women in this. So, you know, I'm not just using it as blokes, but also
guys is non-binary, isn't it?
You're non-binary, yeah, absolutely. You know, there's this idea that good guys come riding into town. You know, I guess I'm referring to Westerns here. You know, with their white hats on, and they sort everything out. Well, actually, without more good people behind them, it's very, very difficult for them to do that. Sometimes they can inspire a movement. You know, if they're there at the right time. I mean, timing's important, but ultimately, just one good person is likely to fail, you know, unless they have something behind them. So this idea, and I think, I mean, I sort of refer to it in the article as king across the water, king or queen across the water syndrome, which is a direct reference to the Jacobites. It kind of doesn't work, you know, unless there's people who are willing to get involved and follow. And I think at the moment what we've got is a situation where we're expecting people at Westminster and Holyrood to kind of deliver for us.
Well, some people think that. Some people think that. And the problem with that is these are, you know, Westminster quite obviously, but you know, I'm arguing there that, you know, in that article that Holyrood is essentially a branch office of the British state as well. You know, British civil service and all the rest of it. And the problem is that the British state, British institutions have a long history of eating good people for breakfast. Essentially, you know, good people get chewed up and spat out. They either get spat out as newly formed flunkies, or they get destroyed. You know, Parnell's the example that I give in the article. But expecting people not to be changed by that experience very often, you know, coming up against raw power, because the British state is about raw power. But it's also about charm, you know. It's a crocodile with a smile on its face. You know, it's drawing people into this sort of sense of comfort. And you know, the British built an empire on this, you know, charm. And you know, they went into India and charmed the Maharajas. And charmed or they got them to cooperate. You know, in many cases they had client states. But you know, that's what we forget. Yeah, but it's they couldn't have done that with the military force that they had. They had a big army at the time, but you know, it would have been nigh on impossible. You know, and the old story about India was that you know, there were very, very few actually British troops in India. Most of the troops that were controlling it and the civil service were Indian essentially. Yeah. You know, hence a couple of rebellions. You know, when there were real cultural. There were real cultural issues, like the you know, the cartridges that had pig fat on them, and so on and so forth. So you know, they're charming, but behind that mask, behind that facade, they're evil bastards.
They're ruthless,
evil bastards.
Yeah.
As we're finding out, and we're going to discuss later, the latest on that. But you go on in your to finish off on your article, which was fantastic. We got lots of comments, and I'm sure after people see this, we'll be getting more.
Thanks.
But you go on to say that we shouldn't waste our time sending down and hoping good people go to Westminster. That we should take a leaf out of the book of Sinn Féin from 1918, who then replaced the Irish Parliamentary Party of Parnell and declared independence. That we're wasting people. It's like, I don't know, the First World War, sending the troops over the top towards the machine guns. There's only one outcome, and sending them there. And you also say to Holyrood. I think that would get a bit more debate from others. But that, in essence, with the exception of Holyrood, is what the SSRG are advocating, which is abstentionism from Westminster, and calling having a plebiscite, general election, not taking up the seats, not giving the oath, and declaring independence. That's the position. I say you just go one step further. You question whether we should actually be going to Holyrood. Although, if I could just say, the SSRG say that we should declare first, before any UK general election, that the only parliament we recognise is the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. That's their position. What's your position?
Well, my position is that given what's happened to the SNP, these institutions are corrupting. Essentially, these institutions, I saw Alfie Baird actually commenting on the article that I wrote, and he was suggesting that the problem is the civil service at Holyrood. Possibly it is, but as we often say, the devolution's a bit of a trap, and there's a big issue for anyone who. There's a big issue at Holyrood and at Westminster for anyone who's genuinely doesn't believe in a royal family, if you like, in a hereditary head of state. That is that under the British system, in these two parliaments, you have to swear allegiance to.
And we've seen the way our present First Minister fawns over the royal family. It's quite nauseating, especially to an old Republican like me. But just if I could finish off, could I just say this?
Indeed.
That you say that Westminster corrupts the MPs we send down there. But can I say, in my opinion, the person that corrupted the people we sent down to Westminster and to Holyrood is the same person, and she's never been in Westminster. So I would suggest she's corrupted it. Westminster, of course, welcomes corruption, as again we will discuss later. For the moment, Roger, can I thank you greatly on your so far, and ask you if you could stay with us, because we're going to have our usual weekly discussion now on things that have been happening in that corrupted cesspit they call Westminster, and we would like your opinions on that. And for that, I welcome not just yourself, but there he is, the Paisley Mohawk. My good big buddy, Mr. Lawson. How are you, young man? I use the term very loosely, by the way, just because you're 6 months younger than me, that's all.
Well, I mean, it looks more than that. That'll surprise readers. They'll be concerned about how bad condition you're in there, Roddy. I've got to say that was fascinating. I mean, they say every day is an education, and learning that the US managed to get independence from Westminster without a Section 30 is quite remarkable, And I can expand on the poor chap that came up to Edinburgh with the suggestion of a more modern monetary system. He turned up, but he wasn't part of the cult. And not being part of the cult, he had to put his proposals forward to Andrew Wilson along there at Charlotte Cheap Partners, and the answer was no, and he had to return back down south. So I hope that helps the conversation.
Yeah, but it's been a hell of a week, and I'm sure we'll get lots of comments on what Roger's spoken to us about there, because as we didn't get proper history teachings in our own times at school, a lot of our population don't know the truth of what goes on. So it's important that we, everywhere we can, do that. But this week, Iain, if I could come to you first, COP26, of course, has been a big thing. And our First Minister said it wasn't the place to be politicking, talking about promoting Scottish independence, but didn't stop her promoting herself, shall we say.
Well, I mean, I've been looking at the National this week, and I mean, there's photographs of Nicola with everybody, and I mean, it reminds me of these groupies that stand outside a pop concert at the door, hoping to catch a moment with each of the stars, you know. But I mean, the thing that readers should really be looking at, what's the background to all these photographs? They're all, the background to them all is a general soiree in Kelvin Grove Museum. None of them are proper meetings. None of them are sitting down and discussing about the serious issues or what's happening in terms of independence of Scotland. These are, as you say, selfies for Nicola. She would have her photographer there. She knew where to stand. She'd smile and look nice and get her photographs taken for the family album. You know, but I mean, in terms of delivering anything serious, I mean, at the start of the week, I was really, really concerned because she was issuing press releases by the minute. You know, all, you know, I don't know where they were going because none of them were appearing in the newspapers, but you would
the National, been the National.
Yeah, been the National that she'd been issuing a press release on this and a press release with that. And then she made the classic mistake of appearing with Greta Thunberg, you know, and everybody's saying, who's that there with Greta round the world, you know? I mean, it was not the cleverest move, but I mean, she was desperate to get publicity. And I can understand it. I mean, I don't like Nicola. I think she's betrayed us. But, you know, it's not good for Scotland for us to be in this position. It's not good. And, you know, I'd have hoped that, you know, she might have managed a bit more than she's managed, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I immediately thought of John Cleese in the famous "Don't mention the war." I can almost see her getting into "Don't mention independence, don't mention independence." But as part of that, it was noted by people like ourselves, shall we say, Scottish patriots, people who do really want independence above all else, that she, at Bute House, where she was having some of these selfies, Roger, she removed the saltires. She took the saltire down off the roof of Bute House so as not to offend the British. I don't know how you feel about that. I'm actually having to contain myself here just now. Because how did you feel about that? Because I know I'm going to ask Iain in a minute, and then I'm going to switch down ask Techie to switch down the volume.
I'll try and be as calm as possible. I was pretty shocked by that. I was pretty shocked when I saw the photographs in that room where, you know, there's usually those prominent saltires. I haven't seen photographs of the outside of Bute House, but yeah, if they've taken that down as well, there's clearly been some sort of agreement between her and Johnson. You know, some sort of, you know, right, we'll allow you to go to our party and get a few selfies with Angela Merkel or whoever it might be. If you take down all the saltires, I mean, what's that all about? I mean, honestly, it's.
Well, could I just add a note of caution to all the viewers just now? Please switch down your volume. I'm now about to ask Mr. Lawson the same question. Okay,
well, I've got to correct Roger. It wasn't an agreement. It was undoubtedly an instruction. And you know, the poodle that lives at Bute House. It's a very obedient little dog. It done exactly as it was instructed to do. And it removed all these offending flags of our nation, which caused such heartache to the visiting dignitaries from south of the border. I mean, it's appalling. And I mean, it's just a sign of the times. I mean, I can't imagine our country ever being lower in self-esteem than what the current Prime Minister has managed to achieve in the last few weeks. I mean, she has become a poodle to Westminster. We need a lion in Scotland, someone that will fight for Scotland. Instead, we've got a poodle. It's sad.
But it goes back to your point, Roger, if I could say it's right. You know, don't depend on a leader to take you out of this. It's up to us to do it ourselves, because she's certainly proven, I mean, anyone that thinks now after what we've seen these last few weeks, and I'm not finished yet, by the way, to believe that she's the one to carry us to our promise of freedom. No.
Yeah, this is our problem, isn't it? We've got a lot of people waiting on a specific individual, thinking that it's all going to be delivered. Secret plan. It's all going to be delivered on a plate. I personally don't think that you deliver independence by hiding your own flag.
No.
It's a radical thought.
but Iain,
they'll not know we're coming.
But Iain, she then goes on to CNN, and when she's interviewed and says, "I've got to get my words right here. It is my intention, or it is my plan, to hold an independence referendum in 2023. Could I just say it is my plan to marry Beyonce in 2023?
My money's in you, Roddy.
Hey, what can I tell you, mate? You know what I mean? But I mean, she did. She's. I've got to say this part. She's very clever. The words that she uses. She's always got herself a plausible deniability about everything she says.
Absolutely. I mean, the one that can't quite manage that's Ian Blackford. I mean, he went too far when he said we will not allow Scotland to be dragged out the single market. You know, and eventually, you know, he picked up the dice to roll them again. There was no dice in it, and he went down this big ladder right down to the bottom, exposed. You know, exactly. just patter, no substance to it at all. And the same with Nicola. Nicola's very clever, and I agree with you. She's very good at having wording that she can bring about plausible deniability. And I mean, even if Nicola got cornered in 2023, she would escape because she would leave the role at that point and leave someone else to break the promise rather than her. And she would never describe it as a promise. If she was serious about 2023, she would reply to that question, well, I promised to deliver a referendum in 2023, and I will keep that promise. That's an answer that has some credibility. But saying, I hope to be able to do it.
Maybe I like, yeah.
That maybe it's I, maybe it's no. Kenny Douglas should answer that. You know?
But from your point of view and my point of view, certainly, and I believe Rogers too, from what he was saying in his article, we're damn glad that there's not going to be a referendum because we would lose it.
I mean, a referendum's a trap. You know, it's like an animal wandering about the jungle and looking at the trap and saying, I want to jump in there. And just you wait, I'm going to come jump in there in the next couple of days.
It's a nice tasty bit of meat, that. I think I'll have it.
That's it. Just a wee dango, just a wee note of paper. It says same franchise. And you go, well, never be seen again.
But again, Roger, nothing came out today. They made me show. And if it doesn't, and I mean, for the most diehard SNP people out there, the devotees, surely this must be the red flag, which is Gordon Brown, the biggest tomb tabard since John Balliol, turns around and says he would like to see and recommends that Nicola Sturgeon heads up the UK Climate Change Commission that he wants to set up. Now, when Gordon Brown is pushing you for a position in the UK, a UK commission, surely that should tell everybody in Scotland, she's a safe pair of hands for the union, and a bad article for our independence movement, surely. Or am I being over dramatic?
Well, possibly it takes a tomb tabard to know a tomb tabard. You know what I mean? It's you know, Google it, folks, if you don't know that one, because it's an interesting one. It just, to me, it just shows how far things have gone. You know, when Gordon Brown or Gordon Brown's organisation, you know, are looking at her as the person to chair this group. You know, it's quite. I mean, games are obviously being played here. You know, Nicola Sturgeon is trying to pretend that she is ever so gradualist and trying to get, you know, massive numbers of people who are a bit feared on board. But you know, to me, you don't do that by undermining confidence in Scotland. You do that by building confidence in Scotland. And everything we see, including this move, you know, because I'm guessing this is a UK group that Gordon Brown's talking about. Everything to me tells me that it's just one compromise after another. You know, compromise and compromise and compromise and compromise. And,
yep. Tell me, Mr. Lawson, did this have, when you saw this, did the cornflakes get splattered?
No, I mean, I just think Gordon Brown's a bit confused. I mean, Gordon Brown sees how Nicola's slowed down independence, and he thinks she'd be the ideal person, therefore, to slow down climate change. You know, there is a link there. You've got to give him credit. But also, it's just that Gordon Brown desperately tries to become relevant all the time. And, you know, it shows you just how bad things are for him, that the names he's dropping now are Nicola Sturgeon. You know, it used to be, you know, President Clinton and various other senior politicians. He's now very attracted to Nicola because she's so slow in independence.
But you'd think that she would take the option and say, nah, whatever Gordon Brown says, count me out, I'm not in. But no, she didn't. I know, I can imagine Alex Sam would have quickly retorted on anything like that.
Yeah, well, she's just wanting to know whether her husband gets a job as a chief executive, that's all.
Which brings me on, I mean, we used to complain in the days when we thought that the SNP was our vehicle for independence, during the times of the famous Bain principle, where anything that the SNP brought to Westminster, they would reject automatically. Didn't matter if it was free beer for the workers, 50 quid an hour for the workers, everyone to get a house, a car. The Labour Party were against it. And that, we thought, when we wiped out the Labour Party in 2015, we thought had gone. But Kenny MacAskill, great guy, brought a motion to Parliament, an early day motion, I think it was, on Ferguson Marine down in Port Glasgow about the Caledonian McBrain ferries, to have an inquiry into this to see if we could save it, if we could save the yard, if we could get those orders into a Scottish yard, save Scottish jobs. And as Kenny rose to his feet, everyone knew what he was getting up to say. All the SNP MPs walked out the chamber, just like the Labour Party used to do to the half dozen SNP people that were sitting there. This was about Scottish jobs in a Scottish yard and keeping one of our most famous and oldest industries alive, Iain. And they walk out the chamber. They sit in I nearly said a naughty word. They sit in that chamber while Scotland's been abused, while they're getting brayed at, while they're getting called all the things under the sun, and Scotland's getting laughed at. They sit there. But when Alba MP stands up to try and save Scottish jobs in the Scottish industry, they walk out. It sums up how far the SNP have fallen, Iain.
Well, as you know, I'm of the mind that we shouldn't have any SNP MPs there in the first place. You know, so, you know, them walking out, I'd like them to see them do it and stay out. But I mean, it just shows you how times change. I mean, the SNP used to complain bitterly when Labour did that to them and said how disgusting it was.
Petty and childish.
Democratic, childish, all the rest of it. And here they're doing it themselves now. I mean, people in Scotland must just look at it, you know, and say, what are these politicians about? Because that's not the way to act. I mean, if I was sitting in the House of Commons and a Tory got up to speak about something to do with Scotland, I would certainly sit there and listen to what he said, even if I didn't agree with it. I'd want to know what his thinking was on it, what he was saying. And I mean, I read Kenny's press release, and there's some very, very, very good points made in it. Absolutely valid points. But of course, part of the problem may well be is that they know in Kenny's speech there was some very embarrassing moments for the procurement process that was followed by the Holyrood Parliament. And they maybe just didn't want to hear it.
No.
But I mean, if you don't hear things, you don't solve things. You don't learn anything for the next time. And that's where they're going wrong. I mean, it's childish nonsense. And, you know, I say to SNP supporters, I know a lot of SNP supporters listen to this programme, and I know I upset them quite often, but for goodness sake, look at the actual issue. Forget the cult, forget the personality. Look at what he was trying to say and do, and don't try to justify ignoring it, walking out, all the rest. It's, letting your constituents down, it's letting your party down, it's letting your country down, and you shouldn't be doing it.
It goes back to something you said earlier, Roger, and it's fact about building up confidence, showing solidarity, all the way there, rooting for the guys in the shipyards and working together. And it is disengaging people. I've seen a few people on social media sort of, I've had enough. They've been betrayed, they feel betrayed, and they don't see any route out. And that doesn't help when they're behaving in that childish and petty manner, especially about something as important as shipbuilding in Scotland. We used to employ 100,000 plus people in the yards. This is the last yard on the Clyde. God Almighty, it's disgusting.
In my lifetime, I lived in Clyde Bank, and there was 14,000 shipyards.
And John Brown alone.
John Brown's alone. Yeah.
Yeah. When you go.
Yeah. To me, what I'm seeing there is people who are putting their party before people, and people mean our country. They're putting their party first if they don't want to hear criticisms of the Scottish government. And two, I'm seeing people who are playing Westminster games, and that is why I'm sure that there were good people who went down there in 2015 or whenever these particular MPs
Some of them
first went to. So what's happened to them? I mean, effectively they've been corrupted. They're playing Westminster games, and they're not fighting our corner. So why are we sending them there?
Well,
why on earth are we sending them there? These are people who have been eaten. I've been told in confidence, that there's some very good people who have been very good MPs, and people who, some people even in Alba are wondering, why they aren't speaking up. And I believe that some of these guys are enjoying garden parties at the weekend in Tory mansions and so on and so forth.
Yeah, not from Alba, from the SNP, absolutely.
Yeah, from the SNP. Yeah. So I mean, what on earth is happening to these people? They're being pulled into, and having lived in England, I've seen it. I've seen these people. At one point, I worked for an organisation that was run by these sorts of charming private school types. A lot of money, charm. But behind that, there's a real nastiness. It was one of the first places where I experienced real serious anti-Scottish racism.
Well, in fact, you're talking about garden parties. Ian and I have had the pleasure of seeing a video of a SNP MP in a musical band with Tories and Labour men in the House of Commons. And talking of Pete Wishart and Owen Patterson, which has got to be the biggest or latest and biggest scandal, the biggest scandal this week, but only the latest scandal, Ian. And there can't be anyone who watches this show who doesn't know what that scandal is. But let me paraphrase it. He received £100,000 from a company involved in pharmaceutical stuff, who then got £133 million contract for PPE, I believe it was, but COVID-related goods with no tender and no competition. He was found to be lobbying illegally, and he was to get 30-day suspension. Well, help my Bob, 30 days out of the House of Commons, but they changed the rules. But what I wanted to say before I bring you in on that, Ian, was that they interviewed Pete Wishart, and they said to him, he said, it's terrible. This is bringing shame and disrepute to our Parliament. Our Parliament, really, Pete? Our Parliament. And they're letting the side down, and it's bad for democracy and a bad day for Westminster. Well, why aren't you rejoicing, you clown? Anything that's bad for Westminster is good for Scotland, Iain, is it not? And that fawning by that little person was disgraceful and disgusting.
Well, I mean, Pension Pete's got his own priorities, and I'm afraid independence isn't one of them.
No, absolutely not.
But I mean, Patterson, he was the one they put up as the scapegoat. But there's a lot more Tory MPs and government ministers involved in that whole PPE scandal than just the guy Patterson. There's a whole pile of them. And I mean, there was billions involved in this, all which ended up offshore. A lot of it for goods that were shoddy, not up to spec, couldn't be used, all the rest. I mean, I'm sure I read somewhere Hancock's ice cream man managed to get a contract for PPE worth millions. And all he did was he was a friend of Hancock's who ran a few ice cream vans. And that was how he got his contract. And then there was loads of them. There was 2 routes, and there was a VIP route where if you could name a minister, you could go in that route and you were bypassing all the normal procurement procedures. And these guys lined their pockets. And of course, we don't know the half of it yet, because the big payout for a lot of that stuff will be when the guys that gave them the contracts leave Parliament or retire. Will be appointed as directors into all sorts of subsidiaries where they'll get their payoff. And that'll be an agreed deal done early doors this now, but not to be revealed until later. The whole place is utterly corrupt. I mean, I didn't think it could get any more corrupt, but I was totally wrong. I mean, it really is disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, I put out a tweet today saying, within a week, maybe before we record our next show, Owen Patterson will have 3 or 4 directorships and be getting suitably rewarded for a couple of hours a month here and there, and a few lunches, a few after-dinner speeches, and he'll be getting hundreds of thousands of pounds a bloody year for it. But it just goes to show that they'll walk out, the SNP MPs will walk out when an Alapa Party man gets up to talk about saving Scottish jobs and Scottish industry, Roger. But they sit there in that Parliament with the corruption oozing out of every part of that building, theft, lying, cheating, corruption, absolute. But they sit through it because they're getting their 82 grand a year plus.
Oh yeah, they're on a good thing. They also seem to quite like complaining about other people and their behaviour, but not really doing anything to get us the hell out of there. So it's slightly frustrating. I mean, I try to avoid a lot of the goings on these days because Ian Blackford and his Scotland should not be removed from speeches. Just he did it for me. But the interesting thing about what's going on in Westminster at the moment, because there's a lot of people going around saying, it never used to be like this, and and all the rest of it. Well, there's always been a level of corruption.
There was no internet before. That's why we didn't know about it.
Yeah, that's part of it. But also the brazen corruption. I think that's possibly one of the things that we're seeing now that wasn't as apparent before. The brazen corruption, because they think they can get away with it, is very, very reminiscent of how corrupt the Westminster used to be. Before possibly things were brushed under carpets in the 20th century, or even the latter half of the 19th century. Go back to the 18th century, and the place's assessment of corruption. It's quite reminiscent. That was the the Parliament that we sent our little tiny number of Scots down to back in 1707 and thereafter. And actually, they realised very quickly that they wanted out of there. It only took about 6 years for them to start to try to get out, including people who had signed up to the treaty. But they couldn't because there was a majority of English MPs who could outvote them.
But we're talking about how there's 2 laws, one for Owen Patterson, who we know got 100,000. God knows what he was given by the companies that got the when they got the contract, as you say, about 100,000. And I managed to find a tweet where a woman who had allegedly over-exaggerated her disabilities and was taken to court for £50,000 worth of housing benefit fraud, they called it, or benefit fraud. She got 33 weeks in prison. He was to get a 30-day suspension. One law for them and one for us. And on that, there has been this week, and it's not been really pushed out there much because COVID's over, as you know, in the UK. It's history. But there's been an outbreak of COVID in the House of Parliament, Iain, and everyone's to wear a mask now. Oh, there's my pal alive.
Fireworks night, you've got to expect it.
Exactly. And but there's to be no lockdown. You know, about 300 people dying a day just now in the UK from COVID. But in the House of Commons, all the staff have to work from home, and everyone's to wear a mask. But the rest of the world is just to go about their way. Two laws, one for them, one for us, Iain.
Well, you know, there used to be that saying, one rule for us, one rule for the rest of you. The new phrase is, one rule for the rest of you, no rules for us.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's just no rules. They do it blatantly, quite openly. They know
no repercussions.
There's going to be no price to be paid. I mean, there you are. I mean, it wasn't as if one person said, Owen, we're going to let you off with this. What they had to do was put down a parliamentary motion, and a majority of MPs voted to let him off with it. Mm-hmm. That's the key difference.
Yeah. In
the past, in a smoke-filled room, somebody might just let you away with something that you did wrong. Nowadays, it's happening in the main chamber. The majority of MPs
live on TV.
I mean, for goodness sake, what are people doing? Yeah. We've become so apathetic about politics in this country that we don't do anything when these things happen.
Yeah.
And because we don't do anything, they get more and more bolder.
Yeah.
And it happens more frequently. Yeah. And what we need to do is give them a real shock.
Yeah.
And, you know, the real shock is getting rid of them all.
Yeah.
You know, once you take them off the payroll, that's when they suddenly wise up that what they were doing wasn't clever. They're never, as long as they're on the payroll, going to be worried about any of this.
Yeah. The problem is with the electoral system we have in the UK, you know, once in most of the seats, I think there's only something like 5% of seats ever change. So if you get a cushy Tory Labour seat, the chances are you're in for life.
Well, you know, I don't know. I'm sure they thought that. I'm sure the Democrats thought that in Virginia.
That was a one-off, and that was on specific.
No. What it was a campaign by the Republicans that exposed all this woo-woo nonsense.
Yeah,
and the public abandoned the Democrats hand over fist.
Correct.
I mean, the SNP are there to be taken on these woo-woo issues.
Yeah,
and the problem for Scotland is, though, if Alba don't do it, it'll be the Tories that'll do it.
That's what I was going to say. And what you want, you know, but that's the problem. You get rid of the Democrat woohoo bit, Chris. You've got the Republican nutter. You know what I mean? Or, you know, he's going to give everyone a gun and arm the teachers and shoot everyone that's not white and hang everyone. That's the problem. And it's the same down in England. You get rid of one Tory. I mean, they're all saying, get rid of Boris Johnson. Okay, let's get rid of him. Who are we going to get? Gove? Patel? Sunak? I mean, it's like death by firing squad, lethal injection, or whatever. But to go in that of the last thing, because as usual, the time flies every week when we do this. And there's one about Humza Yousaf, who took a nursery to bits, to attack him about racism, how they were against him because he was a Muslim and they were Sikhs, and it was racially motivated. And then he announced that he'd won his case for the, and it turns out, Iain, not quite true. What he said.
No.
The exact opposite. He lied.
Well, he misrepresented the judgment. He picked a tiny, tiny bit out the report that appeared to support him, and he ignored the 90% of the report, and in particular the key judgment that there was no racial discrimination or whatever involved, all the allegations that him and his wife had made. Now, you know, it's a sad day because, I mean, the conflicts of interest in that were quite massive. I mean, the Care Commission, who, you know,
answer
makes
into
the
him.
judgment, reports to his department. I mean, it's quite outrageous. He should have resigned as health secretary the minute he made that complaint, and the Care Commission should have been. That should have been the end of it at that point. But I mean, what I am pleased to see is that the nursery owners have been not passive and just taking this in the chin. They've got their lawyers on the case, demanding that the Care Commission amend what they said and make absolutely clear the main point of the judgment was there was no racial discrimination in the way they recruited for the nursery. So, I mean, thanks to the bravery and stubbornness of the people who own the nursery, the truth will out in this, and it's already out now that it's been in the sun.
Yep.
But I mean, it really is, again, an example of him living up to his name. Hums are useless. A title earned and still valid today.
Yeah, but he is a sycophant to Nicola, so he's safe. But going back to what you were saying, Roger, we finish off, if I may, is, you know, in history and time's gone by, how things have changed. He would have had to resign for this. He won't. There'll be no repercussions. Same as there's no repercussions for anything that's the ones who are close to Nicola seem to do, or close to Boris, who are in the Tory party. The fact that Owen Patterson's not in jail is just ridiculous, or at least facing criminal charges. But nothing will happen. The standards have slipped completely. There is no standards now, is there?
No. This is the problem, isn't it? That we've now got a situation, and we've got a situation at Holyrood as well as Westminster, where people are getting off scot-free with behaviour that only a few years ago wouldn't have been allowed in plain view, in plain sight. So, you know, the problem is that, you know, one person gets off with it, and another person thinks that they can get off with it as well, and then another, and then another. And so we have serial. I mean, effectively, I mean, the phrase that's coming to my mind is abuse of power. I mean, this is essentially what we're seeing. We're getting people who think because they're in a position of power, of they have a ministerial limousine or whatever it might be, that they can bully people. They can take people to court. They can make complaints, and they will get their way. And to me, that's a corrupt way of thinking, and we see it in London, and we're seeing it in Edinburgh as well. And that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing at all.
But let me throw into this the absolute horrific detail that the man we're talking about here was the architect of the hate crime bill. I cannot think of anyone more unsuitable to be involved in the production of a law like that, a law which, by the way, should never ever come into force.
No.
But I mean, Hums are useless. You know, he was trying to start a racial dispute himself here. He was picking on people of another religion and trying to persecute them, and use the power of his position in the Scottish Parliament to do it. Thank goodness it didn't succeed. Thank goodness that the people involved on the other side were strong enough to stand up to it.
Here. Well, it's something in the future when Scotland becomes independent, because it will, folks. All that's happened is it's been delayed. The day Winnie Hume was elected in November 1967 guaranteed we were going to be independent. The only two questions that were left were when and how, and there's still questions that have got to be asked. But one thing I would like to see, guys, as a last point here, definitely this is the last point, is that in our constitution, when we write it up, that things like Owen Patterson and Humza Yousaf and did I say Kirsty Blackman and the bullying of Joanna Cherry and other such atrocities and wrongdoings are not allowed, and that there is a punishment for them, that we have a proper clean politics. That's what I want to see. Iain, Roger, it's been an absolute pleasure, old chap. And I'll just repeat to you all again, folks, if you haven't gone to my blog site recently, go www.barheadboy.com and look for Theories of History and read what Roger had to say. And if you've enjoyed this, please, I should have said this at the beginning of the show, hit the like button, because it helps us get listings on YouTube. So if you like this, hit the like button And if you haven't already subscribed, please do so. And until I see you all again, to you and yours, please, please, take care. Oh, and a good night from our sponsor.
Cheers. Good night.
Cheers. Thanks very much.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.